Welcome to yet another episode of the Saxon Series. This time, we finally managed to wriggle our way into the 21st century. And what a century that turns out to be, when the internet revolution starts to upend our old ways, gives us Wikipedia, and creates a whole new realm of possibilities and exchanges. You're listening to one now. How's that for a thumbs up? Last time we've covered the 20th century, the latter half, which was quite a half because a lot happened, but it cleared the way for new things happening in the 21st.
I would say, Martin, a lot didn't happen. That's the story of Low Saxon in the second half of the 20th century.
Yeah, what do you mean by that exactly? So what didn't happen?
The speaking and passing on of the language.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. People
Basically,
generally...
In a nutshell.
Yeah, quite right. Right before the start of the 21st century, we get into 1996, when Low Saxon was recognised under the European Charter for Regional and Minority Languages. We've covered that in the last episode. But that set in motion a new way of thinking about it. And at the same time, something happened which is called the internet.
Yes, so I imagine we'll be talking extensively about the internet. First, let's have a look at the educational scene.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, like you said, Low Saxon and other regional and minority languages got recognition following the implementation of a European-wide charter from the Council of Europe on the recognition of regional and minority languages, which invited member states to take measures to protect and foment the languages of this kind spoken within their borders, which had consequences for Low Saxon rather, spoken in Germany and the Netherlands. For instance, in the realm of education, because as a direct result of this political recognition, Low Saxon has started to be introduced as a school subject, particularly in Germany, in some primary schools and secondary schools in the northern federal states where Low Saxon has traditionally been spoken. And in the Netherlands, we're a bit slower about this. Some steps are being taken here too to start paying some modest attention to the Low Saxon language and associated culture in schools.
Mm-hmm.
Bit late for us too.
Yeah. I must add that I think as early as, which sounds quite dramatic, but as early as 1995, I think the former Van Deense Institute, which was somehow occupied with the preservation of the Twents language, created a lesson series called Het Twents Kwartierke, which is the Twents Quarter. They somehow failed to see that if you don't market it properly and convince school boards that this is a useful language to implement in your schools, they failed to see that would help seal the deal, because I don't think it was a huge success, and only a few schools in Twente actually went on to implement this lesson series. So that's on a primary school level.
And even so, it sounds very familiar to me. This Twents Kwartierke, Drents Kwartiertien, these 15 minutes of a Friday afternoon when some songs are played in Saxon, and it's a bit of a cultural nod rather than like
a wink,
which is fine in and of itself, but it's
hardly enough.
Well, it's, I would say, completely divorced from language preservation as such. I mean, Low Saxon, the general picture is still widely spoken mostly by elderly people, albeit with a lot of influence from Dutch and German respectively. and is virtually not spoken anymore by children and teenagers, and not very much by young adults.
But do keep in mind that the language had long been stigmatized heavily, and even a quarter of Low Saxon in classrooms was a giant leap in my book. But don't know how you feel about that. But.
Sure, no, I mean these cultural impulses do lend a more positive image to the language, which helps create the it helps lay the groundwork for any further steps, serious steps to address the disappearance of the language.
And of course,
but
in
and of themselves, these cultural initiatives do not stop at all the ongoing replacement of the language by Dutch in the Netherlands and by German in Germany.
It's hardly effective. Quarter of an hour on a full week. That's basically one school break.
It's effective if you want to teach a song or something like that, or a poem. Like in Germany, there's a handful of poems by Augustin Wibbelt, who was a poet from Westfalen, are taught in schools and memorized by pupils, which is all very well because it's part of their culture, but it's completely unrelated to their ability to speak Saxon as a living language, obviously. So the steps that are now being taken, more so in Germany as of yet than in the Netherlands, it is to be hoped from our perspective, us who would like to see regional languages being maintained alongside the national languages and, of course, English. It is to be hoped that the presence of Saxon and the introduction of Saxon in schools will move more towards more from cultural tokenism and these 15 minutes of a Friday afternoon to actually, ideally reintroducing it. It's far-fetched, of course, but reintroducing it as a spoken language, just like you would reintroduce a language like Cornish, my go-to example in Cornwall, a language that's completely disappeared and is making a comeback because it is taught in certain nursery schools, so children actually are speaking it again alongside English as a mother tongue. Right, but this is an open question. Like, how will Germany and the Netherlands fare? Because the initiatives that are being taken are extremely recent.
Yeah, they are. They, I think, in the last 10 years or so, we see a complete lesson, a complete curriculum. That's what I wanted to say. A more complete Low Saxon curriculum being created and rolled out, especially in Germany, in certain states. You're highlighting something here. Low Saxon is an elective school subject in the federal states of Hamburg since 2010, Schleswig-Holstein since 2014, and Mecklenburg-Vorpommern since 2016. So that's fairly recent. The first 10 years of the 21st century, not much happened, but things are looking up. In Niedersachsen, which is the German state of Lower Saxony, it's integrated partially in other subjects. Since 2017, it's a recognised oral and written examination subject in that particular state.
No, generally speaking. But it has to be kept in mind that the possibility of introducing it as a subject exists for schools. So some schools offer it and some do not. Just like some schools offer Greek and Latin, others do not. Not all schools are the same. Some schools will say, well, we have no time and space and money for teaching Low Saxon here, so we're not going to bother with it. Other schools may be more receptive to it. They may be in rural areas where speaker numbers are still fairly strong, and identity Saxon identity is more strongly present still.
But I believe the possibility exists for the Netherlands as well, because it says on the Dutch government website that Low Saxon is... You're free to teach Low Saxon if you believe your school will benefit from it. And so it's not a subject as such, but it can be a mode of communication.
Yeah, it's the freest kind of political invitation without creating an imperative on the part of the government to do and to take any specific steps, is to say, well, if schools want to take this up, this gauntlet, they can. But of course, without any infrastructure being put in place, without any objectives being formulated, without any teaching material being created and offered, it's not going to happen organically, right? You have to offer a structure. There has to be some measure of top-down steering as well.
Quite right.
And to make a start with that, curiously enough, someone you once had on your Low Saxon podcast, Veelsprake, the singer of a rock band from our province of Overijssel, Hendrik Jan Bukkers, also has a background in education and was engaged by the Iesselakkedemie, cultural institution of our province, to formulate kerndoelen Neder-Saxisch, so core targets for Low Saxon.
Exactly.
As a school subject, which are the basic objectives.
Rough outlines.
Yeah, an outline of what is to be achieved by dealing with Low Saxon as a subject in schools.
It involves a bit of history, a bit of language knowledge, and I think the overarching goal is to make students and pupils feel more positively inclined towards Low Saxon. Now that is a very broad goal. So
yes, I've got the kerndoel and the key objectives here.
Oh right.
I think they were formulated in the Corona year 0 last year. So I don't think this is a reality in schools yet, but it's vers van de pers. It's just off the press, and let's see where it goes from here. But there are 5 such objectives, and the first one, as you say, is fomenting a positive attitude about Low Saxon, which would be a huge pivot away from the traditional image of Low Saxon as the preserve of clodhoppers and yokels and illiterates and other deplorables.
Yeah, backward people.
Step number 2, or another objective, is for pupils to obtain a passive understanding of simple Low Saxon through recordings, songs, and texts. Objective number 3 is to stimulate their confidence to use a vocabulary of Saxon that they've learned, and familiarizing them with some frequently encountered words. A 4th objective is writing simple texts, songs, and poems, which is an interesting objective because other than the low-hanging fruit of listening to a song or reading a poem and discussing a poem, all of that is passive, right? The texts, the material exists, it's out there, it's written by 70-year-olds, and the pupils look at it. But here they're actually invited to, if this all comes to pass, of course, to produce their own material in Saxon. And the 5th and last goal is acquiring some knowledge about Low Saxon culture and history.
I still, because one of the core principles is to make pupils produce Low Saxon themselves. But I don't hear anything about, teaching the language as a separate language as such.
I think it's very early days for that, because if
what I mean is, how can you produce a song if you don't know how to use the language?
Well, there would be guidance from the teachers, right. So you'd be invited. Now, in any case, the general picture is that Saxon, though it has its separate roots, has for a long time, but especially in recent decades, since the second half of the 20th century, grown very much closer to the respective standard languages of Dutch and German. So I would imagine that really, just like many speakers nowadays do, you take Dutch or German as a reference framework, and then you Saxonize it. That you can like it or lump it, but that's often the reality of how the language is used nowadays.
Mm-hmm.
So if they then acquire a certain vocabulary, typical words, then they can use those words instead of the Dutch words that they're already familiar with, and then maybe the teacher or whatever qualified person helps them could suggest more Saxon grammatical structures and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I'm just ad-libbing here.
Yeah, I know, but I've noticed that happening even as early as Normal's lyrics. Like, there are some things that don't line up neatly, some things
sure.
that don't rhyme neatly, like you'd expect to. And if you translate it back into Dutch, you'll know that all of a sudden it rhymes.
Exactly. That's very typical of the Saxon lyrics of many songs.
Mm-hmm.
They don't quite rhyme, and then you notice that if you translate it back into the standard language, it would rhyme. So that's clearly what the writer of the lyrics had in mind.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, but still, Martin, it's an important step ahead from our reality back in school, in primary school and secondary school, when Saxon was noted for its absence. Right, it was not even discussed.
Mm-hmm.
Its existence was not acknowledged.
Yeah, I said it was actively ignored.
Well, actively ignored, yes, and in many cases, it didn't even have to be ignored, because teachers would come from other parts of the country and would just have no affinity with the local language anyhow, so it wouldn't figure in their universe. And children growing up, born from the 80s onwards, no longer had it as their native language anyway. And even if, as in many cases was the case, they heard it in the family from their parents and or grandparents and other family members. If you're a child, you take for granted whatever you encounter. Mm-hmm. So if it's informally spoken at home, but it's completely absent in the schoolyard and the classroom, mm-hmm. it won't occur to you to say, hey, when are we going to what's this? Why are we separating school from the regional language?
It wouldn't occur
Obviously,
to you.
No, but we can neatly move on to Low Saxon in other domains of culture. For instance, on television, we've ranted in previous episodes of the Saxon series about the well-nigh complete absence of Low Saxon from the mass media, mm-hmm. television. But in the 21st century, there was the phenomenon on Dutch regional television, by regional television, radio and television stations operated by the province. So each province has its own radio and television network. And it occurred to RTV Oost, the network of Overijssel province, to come up with a soap series in Twents Low Saxon, titled Van Jongelui en Oorlogrond, which ran from 2005 to 2009, and was pretty massively popular, even beyond Overijssel. was later sold on DVD, and there were several episodes. I don't know, 4 or 5, something like that.
I think it even for a short period was broadcast on the national TV channels with subtitles.
That could be. I was already living in Spain, so I watched it on the internet.
I think it was.
Actually, when it started, I was not yet living in Spain. And then in Groningen province, another soap series in Gronings, Boven Water, ran from 2007 to 2009, which I have every reason to assume did fairly well, but was not quite the kaskraker,
the blockbuster.
Not quite the blockbuster series that Van Jongelui en Alle Grond was. Of course, when these series ran, we were in our early 20s, and were you surprised by their sudden appearance? Did you watch them?
I think I didn't really watch it, and I think just around the time that Van Jongelui en Alle Grond aired, that's the time I started to get an interest in Low Saxon.
Yeah. Same here.
So it coincided. I think I started writing for Wikipedia in 2006, which where it all began, and Van Jongelui en Alle Grond ran from 2005. I was never that much of a TV watcher, if that's a word, but this thing ran on local TV, which at the time had a waning following, if we can be so bold. But I think I'm quite on the mark there, that the young people, it was quite popular, but it did better than before, because there was no before. So anything goes, anything.
But I know, as programs went on RTV Oost, this provincial TV channel, it had good ratings. And it was followed up not just by Boven Water in Groningen, but also by a Limburg's regional soap series.
They've actually tried another soap series, more of a comedy series, which didn't quite work. It's called Grote Markt 30. Grote Markt 30.
Is that from RTV Oost?
It is, yeah.
Is this currently running, or are you talking about something?
No, I think they tried to, copy the success of Van Jongelui en Alle Grond, and to make it more of a province-wide initiative, where they also let in people from Salland and other parts of the province. Yeah,
sure. Because just to characterize Van Jongelui en Alle Grond, is about young people and an old land. So
soil,
the old traditional soil. It's about roots and wings, right? Modern life rooted in regional, local culture and traditions and landscapes and what have you. And it was set in Twente, a region within Overijssel province, where Twents, fairly conservative form of Saxon in the Netherlands, is spoken, and so the language spoken was Twents.
I do remember that at the time, people, because it mostly featured actors from the northeast of Twente, and I think they were fairly rigid in allowing dialectal differences. So there's minor variation there, and that's what put most people off who weren't from northeast of Twente, because they didn't hear their own accent represented.
Yeah, well, that's related to what you call, I think you've called, the balkanization of Low Saxon. Everybody is, to the extent that they're familiar with the regional speech, they're familiar with what is spoken in their immediate area, and they don't really have the bigger picture, the concept of Saxon as, if not a standard language, a collection of closely related varieties with shared historical and cultural roots. So there's not much solidarity from town to... Obviously, there's always rivalry between neighboring towns and villages, and there's not much solidarity between regions. It's more
islandization. Yeah.
If you don't speak like me, then it's not my cup of tea.
Mm-hmm.
But I was quite charmed by this soap series. I was told that the younger actors had their language coaches, because this series, it's set in the countryside, the beautiful wooded landscape of Twente, and
quite picturesque. Yeah.
A few characters speak Dutch, but most characters speak Twents pretty much all of the time, which is only partially realistic, because many people do, but young people not so much. But the younger actors in the series also spoke Twents,
mm-hmm.
and a very...
It's like a bit of a utopian view of...
Yeah, a well-cultivated form of Twents, not so much affected by the standard language, where in reality speakers, they code switch all the time. They are inconsistent with the use of Saxon. Now they will use a Dutch word or phonemic, and now they will use a Saxon word or phonemic, depending on what comes to mind first. But in the series, obviously, it was all far more, like you say, idealized.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, it coincided with our growing awareness of Saxon as part of our regional culture.
Mm-hmm.
And
it was the same time I went online on Wikipedia, and I found the Low Saxon Wikipedia next to the Plattdeutsche Wikipedia, which is basically one and the same language, but I saw some articles there written in Drents, and some very clever things were said about several things there in Drents, in Low Saxon. And I think my first baby steps on Wikipedia were about my hometown, and someone commented and gave me some directions, and I think that was the start. And I think that person was Chris, as we're looking at him right now. So there you are.
Really? I wanted to sneak in if you will allow a feature film done in Saxon, and then move on to the internet, and we can start with Wikipedia.
Sure. Can I add one more thing in the cultural expressions? You mentioned, or maybe you didn't, that Herman Vinkers was part of this series, which is a famous comedian from the town of Almelo, which is situated in Twente. And his shows, he used to do his shows in Dutch, but I think from the 80s or 90s, early 90s onwards, he started to gain an interest in the home language of his region, which is Twents, and he started to translate his shows in Low Saxon as well. I think on RTV Oost, he also made a cartoon called Kramske Maria Parochie, which is a very funny film, and it's being played every year still on it airs every year around Christmas, and it's about it explores the idea what happened if the baby Jesus would have been born in Twente. You get a very funny situation, and all the characters there speak Twents, including Joseph and Mary and even the donkeys.
Yeah, it's rather short, right?
Yeah, it's only 20 minutes, but
yeah,
it had
I think the narration is.
What's that?
Sorry, I said I think the narration was in Dutch. Characters spoke Twents.
Yeah, you're quite right. Yeah, the narration is in Dutch, and all the characters speak Twents. But there's still, staple expressions in Low Saxon today, in Twents, Low Saxon today, that originate from that movie, and it's had a huge cultural impact. So, and that's why it's still aired every year.
As does his animated series Macbeth, which, although spoken in Dutch, makes huge and extensive use of if not strictly the Twents Saxon language, expressions lifted from it, and accents, and it's very much a presence, even as the standard language is the means of communication.
Mm-hmm.
So speaking of Herman Vinkers,
Mm-hmm.
this celebrated Dutch comedian, he had another first just last year when a feature film came out, also spoken mostly in Twents, with some Dutch and German thrown in, called in Dutch. Oddly enough, it has a Dutch title. It's probably not to put off prospective viewers, but it's right. So it's spoken mostly in Twents, but it's called De beentjes van Sint-Hildegard, meaning the bones of Saint-Hildegard. But in English, it's called The Marriage Escape.
That's correct, and it went on to become the best viewed film on Dutch television of 2020, and it was the best visited.
Better than that, Martin. It was. I had to wrap my head around this as well. It's the best viewed film on Dutch television since ratings started being recorded in 2002.
Well, there you go.
So at least from 2002 and possibly reaching further back, it's been the best viewed feature film and the best visited film in Dutch cinemas in 2020.
Right.
All this for an authentic Saxon movie.
Mm-hmm.
Did you go and watch it?
I did. I didn't go and watch it, but I waited until until I could conveniently watch it from my home, from my own couch, and which I did. And yeah, it was a lovely film.
But does this mean that it went to television rather fast?
I think it did, but I've only watched it earlier this year, not in 2020. So
yeah, keeping in mind that I live in Spain, I don't, it's not yet available from cinemas in Madrid that I'm aware of.
Mm-hmm. So but you could watch it online, because I think it's on Omroep Max.
Okay, which I'm not necessarily subscribed to. It's not on Netflix or HBO by any chance, or YouTube.
Didn't we mention your age in some earlier podcast?
We did indeed, but even so, like this is almost like the Saxon language, this balkanization and fragmentation, where you're supposed now to be subscribed to this service and that service, and then this is from HBO, that's from Netflix, that's from a third provider, and you want to have a subscription from all of them if you want to watch all of the content that everybody's talking about. Mm-hmm. How can you possibly keep up? One cannot.
One cannot, indeed. So in the film, do you want to do a quick overview of what the film is about, or
you go ahead and do so, and I'll switch the light on here.
Right. So the beentjes van Sint-Hildegard, The Marriage Escape, is basically a reworked version of a rewritten version of a former Czech script called Tigra. Can't remember, but it was a Czech script. So the director Johan Nijenhuis came to Herman Vinkers again, the Dutch comedian, and said, "Do you want to do this movie?" And Vinkers said, "All right, let's do it." But reading the script, he said, "Well, there are some things I'd like to change. Is that okay?" So he then basically rewrote the entire film, focusing much more on the relationship between the main character Jan and his overbearing wife Gerda, which, by the way, was expertly portrayed by Johanna ter Stege.
And Jan starts, battling the onset of dementia.
Well, he feigns the onset of dementia.
No spoilers, Martin.
No spoilers, no. But it's quite clear from the get-go. So, his wife is a university teacher who believes that a man can only thrive when his wife takes care of everything for him. So she does so in quite a constrictive way, and the only way for him to get away from that is, he believes, to feign the onset of dementia. So he's been put away in a care home, and that gives him the space and the room to go about his business. But then, of course, that has an impact on their marriage.
Yeah, so we have this blockbuster feature film from Twente, which previously had its successful regional soap series. It's doing all right in presenting Saxon on the screen, even though it's barely a part of the day-to-day programming of the regional television station. But Twente, at the same time, hardly has any literature being produced in Twente, virtually none, whereas the literary scene is much more important further up north in Groningen and Drenthe, which in turn have not yet.
And the musical scene.
Music too, yes. And I was about to blurt out that Drenthe has not yet had its Saxon movie, but what am I saying? It had Bartje.
Yeah, as early as the 70s, I believe.
All those decades ago, which is another Saxon-spoken film, based on a novel, which, as many regional novels at the time did, was written in Dutch. This book, Bartje, by Anne de Vries, a Drents writer, written in Dutch, but the dialogues are in Drents, Saxon, from the province of Drenthe. And so the films, because the dialogues are acted out, the film is about a farming family in Drenthe back in the, I don't know exactly when, 50s maybe, or even earlier. And this little boy growing up who refuses to pray for his baked beans, which is this one slogan that everybody is able to...
I was going to say that, yes. It's the only thing everybody knows. Everybody.
Do you want to shout it out?
Oh, I'd love to. Everybody from our age and above knows the phrase "Ik bid niet voor bruine bonen." Exactly. I haven't seen the film, I must admit, but I do know this phrase because everybody does.
Yeah. But they're these. So this was way back in the 70s, as you say. So they're these occasional, very successful occurrences, but they change very little and nothing at all about the bigger picture of the regional languages like Saxon being replaced by the national language. It's all firmly in the cultural domain. It's part of the, as we previously referenced, this dialect renaissance, as it's called in the Netherlands, where much more music is being produced in Saxon, multimedia content, but it changes nothing about the fact on the ground that as a language in actual use, it is very fast disappearing.
I think someone else said currently, the attitude towards Low Saxon has never been this good. But at the same time, the command of Low Saxon has never been this low. Yes.
Isn't life ironic?
Yeah. I think in a nutshell, that's a proper summary of the current situation of Low Saxon.
Sure. But we do our best, don't we?
We do.
And we do so on the internet a lot of the time. Among other reaches in Wikipedia.
Briefly touched on that earlier, yes.
Which no one will require an introduction to. But we have the peculiar situation that there is both a German Low Saxon and a Dutch Low Saxon Wikipedia. Do you want to recount that history? Or?
Yeah, briefly, because I think it requires an entire episode on its own. But German Low Saxon, the Low German Wikipedia, began in 2003, and they quickly established that they're going to write according to the Saxon Series. Some Dutchman got wind of that, and he made an account there and started writing in Dutch Low Saxon, which is based on
Standard Dutch
spelling, exactly. The German moderators of the Wikipedia had never seen such a thing before, or if they didn't accept it. So they basically deleted everything the man wrote. So after a short while, he applied for a Dutch Low Saxon Wikipedia at the Wikimedia Foundation. Things got approved, and there we are. We now have 2 Wikipedias for one language. And the German Low Saxon Wikipedia still writes according to SAS, and in the Dutch Low Saxon Wikipedia, any more or less formally accepted spelling, formally accepted regional spelling is accepted. So,
if I can butt in for a second, back in the day, it was also the Dutch side that said, I can't read this German stuff. And yes, up to a point that was to do with what you explained about German Low Saxon being based on German spelling, as the Saxon Series is based on standard German spelling, and Dutch Low Saxon being traditionally written in accordance with Dutch spelling rules. But I think another part of it was just the complete lack of familiarity that each side had with the other's existing dialects. Right. So, say if you're from Drenthe and you speak Drents Saxon, you will be familiar or aware of the existence of Glennis Saxons, which is different, but you know it's out there. And sure, people from the Eastern Netherlands often say, with my language, I can go all the way up to Poland and make myself understood. But I'm not sure if they ever do. But this is this traditional thing that is said. But in reality, familiarity with German varieties of Low Saxon is pretty much non-existent. And even more so the other way around, many speakers of Plattdeutsch in Germany, although this is now changing because of the contact on the internet, have been completely oblivious to the existence of Low Saxon also being spoken in the northeastern Netherlands. So, onbekend maakt onbemind. If you're unaware of and unfamiliar with...
Unfamiliar makes unwanted, unloved.
Yeah, so that it wasn't an organic whole. It failed to come together. So that's basically why it bifurcated, and we have these 2 Low Saxon Wikipedias. In fact, I think we have, strictly speaking, 3, because there's Plattdeutsch,
right,
which has its own Wikipedia, which is the Low Saxon spoken mostly from Canada all the way down to Bolivia and southern Brazil.
With some remnant pockets in, I believe, the Ukraine, and although I'm not exactly sure if they're still around, but the Ukraine and Kazakhstan and the Baltic states and Poland, basically the old Hanseatic trade routes.
Not your typical holiday destinations, but they're out there, we are assured. I looked at a few numbers, and the German Low Saxon Wikipedia now has as many as 82,600 articles. So it's going on 100,000. If you compare that to the Frisian Wikipedia, that has 46,000 articles. So German Low Saxon is doing twice, a subset of Low Saxon is doing twice as well as Frisian, which is a more prestigious language with more government backing. So it's not doing that poorly, although I don't think this German Low Saxon Wikipedia has got a large number of contributors. It must have a number of really industrious contributors.
Yeah, and I've looked at the things they made. Most of the articles are pretty small, and I think they use some sort of template for them, because many of the articles are on, star systems and Kepler X5 number, this and that, and they just fill out the the distance from us and the distance from there, and what gases this planetoid is made of, that sort of thing. So you can easily ramp up your article numbers.
Sure, absolutely. You make a valid point that absolute article count is not the be-all and end-all of the actual importance in the real world of your language. Because after English, which has, what?
Millions.
Couple million articles now, the second biggest Wikipedia version is the Cebuano Wikipedia. And Cebuano being a language spoken in the Philippines.
Really?
The principal language of the Philippines is Tagalog.
Mm-hmm.
So, and nobody's ever heard of Cebuano, if you're not from the region, obviously. And it's bumped up its article count by this process that you describe of creating templates that bots then start populating the Wikipedia version with.
I've actually done
just
it myself.
Numbers are different. Mm-hmm.
I've at one point, I felt that it's about time that we cover all the municipalities of Noord-Brabant, which I don't really have much feeling with, but I still couldn't stand that we hadn't, covered the one of the biggest provinces of the Netherlands yet. So I, rammed out, I think, about 30 articles in the span of a few days.
Yes, but you didn't do what the Cebuano Wikipedia and many others Wikipedias do. You didn't instruct a bot to go out and do that entirely without the intervention of humans.
I think
you created a template, and then you created each article by hand, although working from this standard template, and then you adapted it as the municipality or town in question required. So that's not quite the same level of automation. Plus, it's not a crime in and of itself, and it's been an interesting discussion on Wikipedia. You can probably tell my level of involvement with Wikipedia, my nerdery levels here. But in the early days, a lot of American geographical articles about geographical regions in the United States were little more than numbers, the demographics. And there was this discussion about, should we allow bots to spam out these articles that just give these dry, population statistics, but haven't got any flesh on the bones? And in the end, people who were in favor of this procedure won out. And then we saw these articles being gradually added to with more human and warm information about the local culture and history and economy and what have you. So more than just hard, cold statistics. So it can work, right? To start with the skeleton of the stats and then build it out with more palatable and consumable information. But we're drifting away from the subject of Low Saxon proper, yeah?
We could devote an entire episode on Wikipedia.
Well, we probably should, shouldn't we?
Let's set up an appointment for the next one.
Yeah. So the Dutch Low Saxon Wikipedia now has over 7,000 articles. So the German one was begun in 2003. The Dutch one was begun in 2006. And in our case, we don't have very much automation. It's mostly, manual labor of love. So we plod along rather slowly. And, well, I don't know what you want to say about this, but for a language that has, specifically speaking of Dutch Low Saxon now, still about 1.5 million speakers, none of whom have learned to write Saxon. So anyone who writes Saxon has to just take the initiative himself or herself. So it's understandable that you would have very few writers for what is strictly a spoken language, an informally spoken language. But even so, out of a population of 1.5 million speakers, even if that virtually excludes children and teenagers who no longer have a command of Saxon, but you still have many adults who aren't quite in their dotage yet, who speak Saxon and who could also, access a keyboard if they want to. I've always been profoundly disappointed that the actual number of contributors on the Dutch Low Saxon on an average day varies between 0 and 1 or 2.
Mm-hmm.
Very often nothing at all happens. And then occasionally someone will have a bout of inspiration and write a few articles, and then a couple of months will go by with very little happening. But it's basically you, me, and in the course of the history of the Dutch Low Saxon Wikipedia,
There were about 8.
not yet under 10 people who've done anything substantial.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but you mentioned the old folk, and for some reason they take great pride in not being digitally savvy. Ja, ik zie al, ik weet nog nauwelijks hoe een computer aan moet. I hardly know how to, switch on the computer, and they take great pride in that. But at the same time, they lament that they don't know how to reach out to the young people. So that's my disappointment. And should Low Saxon Wikipedia be the focal point of Low Saxon activism online? Because there's loads of places to do this with a bigger reach.
Yes, and you will tell us about that, because this will go into domains that are of very recent mintage, and
Because the
are very dynamic.
Yeah, the internet is a vast place.
But if we're going to talk about platforms, such very recent platforms such as TikTok and whatnot, and the possibility and or presence already of Saxon there, it would have to be recognized that it's all about content that comes and goes. Whereas Wikipedia is fundamentally different in that it is a record that once you create something, unless the unthinkable happens and Wikipedia disappears, but that's hardly likely to happen. Well, it is just what it says, what it professes to be, an encyclopedia, accessible everywhere to all, if you don't live under a horrible regime, where uniquely you can take the reins in hand and provide content in your language, which elsewhere has very little support and very little going for it. But you can write about anything and everything. I've expressed a point of disappointment about Dutch Low Saxon, which is the extremely low number of contributors. But let me also express a point of contentment where we've been kind of evenly distributed along the philosophy. On the one hand, like this is very much something you always emphasize, that Saxon, if it is to be a modern living language, should be apt for use in today's world, to talk about today's topics on today's platforms. And so it should be possible to write a Saxon article about TikTok, or about social media, or about platforming, or wokeism, or any trends that we see.
It's very interesting
in this day and age.
Yeah, because I've actually looked at Google Trends for inspiration for new articles now and again. So, yeah, and I've been of the school that says that's great. I completely agree with that, and I think that parallel to that, we need to have. This is what I want. This is what I want my role to be: a focus on Low Saxon culture, and my speciality here being Low Saxon writers. And I've been creating a rather large number of articles about Low Saxon writers, but also about all sorts of other things related to Low Saxon culture in general, because it's not hardly available elsewhere. And if it's available elsewhere, it tends to be in specialized printed tomes that are not generally available. So if you want to know about your Drens writers, all these novelists and poets and other writers that have, from the early 19th century up to our day, continue to create literature in Drens, either you're going to have to buy these specialized tomes dedicated to this scene,
or subscribe to Low Saxon literary magazine Root, or you're going to have to find this material in a library, for which you'll probably have to travel to Drenthe or Stad Groningen, or you can find it, at the click of a mouse from the comfort of your easy chair on Wikipedia, which is where I make an effort to make it freely available.
Do you know, the other week, something came to light that there is a monthly group in the Library of Hengel writing on 20 topics on the Dutch Wikipedia. And there's a group of 8 people there, and none of them has taken the... I've sent them all a personal message saying there's the Low Saxon Wikipedia out there as well. How about you give that a try? Some have responded, but as you might have noticed, none of them has so far taken it upon themselves to, apply their writing talents to the Low Saxon Wikipedia.
Sure. And if we bring a few things we've discussed now together, you could ask the question, would it be conceivable that if Saxon starts being offered as a school subject, not necessarily in the sense of a language for day-to-day use, but at least create a measure of, not quite fluency, but knowledge and know-how, including written Saxon, might you not then, from that pool of youngsters, find people who it won't take the impossible to convince them of even the possibility to write in Saxon?
Well, there could possibly be, but you first need to have you need some sort of proficiency, or you must dare to write in Low Saxon, or have some sort of level of fluency to dare to try your hand at this this beast of a language that is for which there are so many different spelling systems. And be careful where you tread, because you're going to offend some people one way or the other. And
but Martin, I have a question in connection with this. If it's so uncommon and so almost unthinkable to combine the ability to speak Saxon, which is increasingly rare, with the willingness to put it in writing and even on the internet, then are we two and 2 or 3 other chaps, almost exclusively young males, are we completely nuts to be working on this project of creating a Saxon encyclopedia? Why do we do something that it's proving next to impossible to convince even a small number of people to join in with, out of these hundreds of thousands of speakers of Saxon?
Why do we do this? Because
what's going on?
We once started, and it's become an addiction, and we have a certain idea that this must be done, and someone has to do it, and if we soldier on long enough, we're going to cover some of the domains that might one day inspire some youngster to, hit that edit button and fill in a few words, and then we're going to, welcome him with open arms and say, you're going to be the next star of Low Saxon. Yeah, so it's a one-off every time. And I think, it's, for me, it's a sort of activism that, Low Saxon has lost so much ground, and we've lost so many domains. We need to reconquer these. We need to cover as broadly a range of topics as possible to, inspire some people out there, and I know they are, to make them realize, wow, this can be done in Low Saxon, and this particular topic, this strange topic that I'm interested in, only me, is available in Low Saxon. And there have been people who've taken the time to use this language to describe the things I love. And I think that level of dedication speaks to, well, how profound we feel about this language, right? Yeah, it's hard to put in words, but yeah, I think
there's a fair amount of quiet appreciation anyhow. Just like
people don't stop us.
Well, Mr. Nog bijkomen. Knock on the door. What do you think you're doing? Would you please move on to more, more mainstream pursuits?
I saw that you wrote something on the internet spelling OA instead of AO. How dare you? This is the AO police. Open up.
If you take a useful article on the English Wikipedia, if it's a specialist subject, chances are that it's mostly been written by one person, and then there will be any number of edits by bots and small tweaks by other editors. That article, unless it's extremely obscure, now on the English Wikipedia, is going to be read, or is going to be seen by an impossible to tell but large number of people around the world, sooner or later.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to be referenced, it's going to be processed, it's going to be used in whatever way. So it was one person who originated the content, and then any number of people, passive consumers of the Wikipedia article, who then may go on to do active things with it, make use of the fruits of that one person's labor. Now, this is how I conceive of the Low Saxon Wikipedia. Even if we continue to soldier on like this forever, a handful of mavericks, and we never get the any greater substantial number of contributors, it's still going to be used in ways that you just can't measure it. Like you cannot. At least I assume it's not possible to see page views, or maybe it is. But anyway, to have a clear appreciation of what is done with the knowledge once you broadcast it, once you put it out there. But there are indications. For instance, a book, which is a popular introduction to Dutch Low Saxon, was published last year in Dutch, and then an English translation was published. Neder-Saxisch in een notendop, Dutch Low Saxon in a nutshell. Particularly the section on the history of Saxon, from Old Saxon through Middle Saxon, Middle Low German, as it's usually called, up to the modern time. As the authors of the book themselves wrote, a lot of that had for its source the Dutch Low Saxon Wikipedia, i.e. most of it little old me, because I specialize in literature and history, and so I probably wrote the articles in question, and a lot of it appears to some extent verbatim in the book, which is, of course, I'm beating my own drum here, but it's just an example of how the content does get access, it does get used, it does get appreciated, it does find its way out to consumers and people who use it in whichever way that we won't necessarily be aware of. And one last point, because I'm keenly aware that I'm starting to drone and go on and on again. If you have the ability to not just access and reference the English Wikipedia, but also other language versions, you will often see, for instance, take the English and the Dutch Wikipedias, right? The content on Dutch-specific subjects on the Dutch Wikipedia blows the English content on these Dutch subjects out of the waters.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to know something useful and substantial about Dutch-specific subjects, often, yes, the English Wikipedia will be able to help you up to a point, but if you're at all able to, it's preferable that you consult the Dutch Wikipedia, because it will have far more extensive articles, and often it will have articles where the English Wikipedia is done, all of which is perfectly understandable. The same is true for Low Saxon, both Dutch and German. A huge amount of content there is just not interesting enough to people who have no affinity with the language and who don't think to write articles in those other languages on those subjects.
Mm-hmm.
And even if they're from the region, like this little mercenary army that you mentioned of people over in Hengel, was it,
mm-hmm.
who gather in the library on a weekly basis to write articles on Twente subjects, even they will not magically start writing articles about the Neder-Saxische Beweging or Arnold Rakers or Owen Lam or all these Saxon language-specific subjects that we have got covered
Mm-hmm.
on our Saxon Wikipedia. So it fills a void. It's not just another translation of a bigger Wikipedia out there. It's got a huge amount of information you just will not find elsewhere, or not as easily in any case.
Mm-hmm.
Full stop.
Right. One consideration is that because there is no consensus about spelling, and because there are so many different spellings present on Wikipedia, and the fact that people who are using Google usually ask Google questions in Dutch or in English, they will never find Low Saxon articles.
That's not quite true. Because if they enter a name or the name of a movement, as a case in point, if you type Neder-Saxische Beweging, Low Saxon movement, which is about an era of fruitful Dutch and German cooperation on Low Saxon, particularly on the literary front, back in the 1950s. Now, it just so happens that there is an article on the Dutch Wikipedia about this as well, written by yours truly, but it's based on the Dutch Low Saxon one, which will have interwiki links to aspects to do with that.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it's neither here nor there to ask whether anyone will look up Neder-Saxische Beweging in the first place, but it's just an example.
Mm-hmm.
I think for a lot of search terms that you could come up with, if an article on it exists in the Dutch Low Saxon or German Low Saxon Wikipedia and not in the Dutch or German or English language version, then and only then will that search term, will that result come up fairly high up the ranking in Google.
Was that a question?
No, mate, it's an observation.
All right. Yeah. Because your intonation went up at the end.
So, it's just my California Valley girl.
Yes, and it suits you. So, do you want to cut it off here, or do you want to go on about the presence on Wikipedia and social, the introduction of the social media, because that's another topic in itself, I think.
Yes, which is the Internet 2.0, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
The more interactive internet.
And that concludes our 5th episode. Next up, we'll take a deep dive into our current era dominated by user-generated content. If you don't want to miss out, hit the like button and do subscribe. See you next time.